Carving is easily my favorite mechanic in Orion Drift, and not just because it makes turning feel so much more smooth with your momentum, but also because it applies to more than just the ground. This is wall carving. If you have any desire to be good at Orion Drift movement, you have to learn wall carving. On top of feeling super cool, just a few of its use cases involve traveling great distances across a wall, quickly getting around large obstacles, and turning forward momentum into upward momentum. So, first things first, find a spot to practice. Any spot with a large flat wall available to you is going to be perfect, but when I'm teaching new players, I generally start them off with this wall, which you can find inside the Master Gym. The first step in understanding how to wall carve is understanding exactly what it is. Essentially, when you wall carve, you're attaching your player to the surface of that wall. And as you move your hand in a direction, you can control the direction of your player's velocity. The very basic wall carve I like to teach people is taking downward velocity and then turning into forward velocity and then turning into upward velocity. Just a quick example of this would be dropping off of this wall and carving forward like this. This is what most wall carves are going to be. The reason being that you have to be changing your momentum in order to stay in a wall carve. If I try to go straight, it'll kick me out. So, in order to travel as far as possible, you must start going down, then going forward, and then going up. So, how do you do this? The first step in understanding wall carving is to map a wall in a two-dimensional plane in your head. That's because when you start a carve, you are locked to the plane of that wall. Even if you push your hand further out, you don't actually gain momentum in the direction you push yourself away from. You're still locked to that plane. So I can carve like this, and push myself out, and I'm still on that wall. Now that you understand some of the properties of carving, I want you to think about your directional velocity. So, in any carve, you actually need some amount of directional velocity to initialize the carve. And in the case of a wall carve, the only directional velocity that matters to us is along the plane of this wall. Because again, we're only carving along a two-dimensional plane, which is the wall. Now, in order for the game to actually recognize your carve, your hand needs to be stretched out perpendicular to your directional velocity. In the case of these examples so far, I've been using our gravity as our directional velocity. And because gravity is just straight down, I'm going to stick my arm straight out, which is perpendicular to that. Now again, even though you can carve at any distance from the wall that you can reach, it's easiest to start your carve as close as you can get. So I like to put my head and arm very close, tight up against the wall. Now, in order to actually initialize the carve, you need to move your arm against your velocity, which in this case is over my head. Also keep in mind that if you don't move your hand fast enough, you'll just fall right off. So you have to start the carve with a certain amount of speed. Hopefully now that you understand this, you'll be able to do your very first wall carve. Just like this. Now, remember the speed at which you move your hand against the carve is the speed at which you can change your direction. Essentially, your direction is always going to be perpendicular to my hand. So when my hand is straight up in the carve, I'm going to be forward. When it's behind me in the carve, I'm going to be up. I say these things to introduce you to one of the first problems you're probably going to encounter with wall carving. So it's likely that when you first start carving, you're unable to do very large carves. It's really easy to do something like this, and a lot harder to do something like this. And you may notice that when you try to do a large carve, you just fall right off the wall. And the reason for this has to do with initialization. I'm not going to dive too deep into initialization, but the short of it is that in order to start the carve, you need to move your hand at a fast enough speed to where it recognizes that you're carving. Once you start the carve, you can slow your hand down a ton and do a much wider, slower carve. But you still have to move your hand pretty quick in order to initialize it. So this is the motion that I'm doing when doing a relatively wide carve. If you were watching closely, you probably noticed that my hand started off with a lot more speed than it ended with. And that's really what you have to start doing when you're doing larger carves. You have to move your hand at a speed to initialize the carve, and then you can slow it down. So, just keep that in mind when you're trying to do wider carves, that you still have to start it fast and then slow it down. Now it's time to use that knowledge to do a different kind of carve. Instead of taking our downward velocity to do a long carve, we're going to be using our forward velocity to do a carve upwards. So, just think about that 2D plane, think about your velocity relative to that, which is going to be straightforward, and now think about how you need to position your arm in order to carve that. And if you've been paying attention, we're going to stick our hand straight up, perpendicular to our forward velocity. Now this one we're actually going to need to run to get a bit of speed because we don't have gravity doing that for us. And after a bit of practice, you should be able to do that. Finally, let's think about a carve where we have both forward and downward velocity. By the time we hit that wall here, our velocity should be about 45 degrees downward. So I want to hold my hand at about 45 degrees upward. So let's get a little bit of a running start. Whee! Now, another type of carve you can do that isn't discussed as much is using your forward velocity and turning it into downward velocity. So instead of holding my hand upwards to go up, I'm going to take my hand and hold it downwards, and I'm going to carve backward to go down. I bring that kind of carve up not because you're going to use it much, but just to help you get an idea of what you can do with a carve. Using velocity from any direction, you can carve to change it in any other direction along the plane of the wall, even if it does seem a little silly. And the magic of carves is you can carve however long you need to. You just have to be wary of pushing yourself away from the wall, because the more you push yourself away, you won't be able to actually pull yourself back. But once you're pretty good at it, you can do a full circle. And that's mostly all I have for you. But before I end, I just want to bring something up. Wall carving is an extremely difficult mechanic, especially for new players. It's not something you're going to pick up immediately and master. For you, it may require a ton of tries before you even hit your first wall carve. I bring this up because on my ceiling carving video last week, I had a lot of people come up to me and say, "Hey, I saw your ceiling carving video, but I still can't ceiling carve, can you help me?" And you know what I did? I helped them. I told them exactly what I said in the video, and I showed them the exact things I did there, and they were able to get it eventually. The reason they were able to carve isn't because I said something wrong, it's because it's just hard and it takes a lot of practice, so don't give up. However, if you do want some more advanced tutorials in the future, make sure to leave a comment on some of those things you want to see. Anyways, that's about all I have for you. I'll see you in the next one.